Snow buried every footprint except hers. The wind howled through the Brooks Range like something alive, something ancient, scraping across ridgelines that had never once forgiven a mistake. To the rangers stationed in that frozen corner of Alaska, she was nothing more than the coffee girl, the quiet woman who moved through the camp before dawn with a battered metal pot, filling mugs with something warm in a world that offered nothing but cold. Nobody imagined that the shy soldier who scrubbed frozen mugs by lantern light had once been trained to become the deadliest sniper the program had ever produced. Nobody imagined that the hands pouring coffee at 4 in the morning had once held a rifle capable of ending a war from a distance no one believed possible. Then the ambush came, and everything the camp thought it knew about her was about to be rewritten in blood and ice. 100 rangers were trapped deep behind enemy lines while dozens of enemy snipers closed in through the blizzard, invisible against the white, patient as death itself. Communication failed within the first hour. Artillery could not reach them through the mountains. Air support was grounded by a storm that seemed to have been sent on purpose. Only one rifle remained capable of changing the outcome of that day, and it belonged to a woman nobody had bothered to ask about her past. At 4,109 meters, Evelyn Hayes closed her eyes, steadied her breath, and squeezed the trigger, and an impossible shot rewrote the battle forever. The Brooks Range in the middle of January was not a place that tolerated softness. Temperatures dropped to 28 degrees below zero, and the wind carried ice crystals sharp enough to cut exposed skin in seconds. The camp sat low in a valley, surrounded by peaks that vanished into cloud, and every ranger who had been stationed there long enough understood that the mountain itself was an enemy before any human adversary ever arrived. Snow fell in waves that lasted for days, burying tents, burying vehicles, burying the sound of boots on gravel until the whole world seemed wrapped in a silence that pressed against the ears. Every morning, before the sun made its brief and reluctant appearance over the ridgeline, Evelyn Hayes walked the length of the camp carrying a large metal pot of coffee, steam rising off the surface and freezing into faint clouds around her face. She moved without hurry, without complaint, stopping at each post to fill a mug, offering a small nod, sometimes a faint smile, rarely a word. The younger rangers had given her names over the months, names spoken with affection rather than mockery. Coffee girl, snow barista, the quiet woman. She never argued with any of it. She never corrected them, never explained herself, never once mentioned a single detail about where she had come from or what she had done before arriving at that remote outpost. Captain Mason Brooks had noticed her calm from the very first week, the way she carried herself through sub-zero mornings without a single visible shiver, the way her eyes moved across the camp perimeter with a kind of attention that seemed almost unconscious, as though scanning terrain was simply something her body did without being asked. He said nothing about it. There were 100 quiet mysteries in any unit this far from civilization, and most of them stayed buried under the daily grind of survival. Logan Pierce, the unit's secondary marksman, had once asked her directly whether she had ever fired a weapon before enlisting in this particular assignment, and she had only smiled, poured his coffee, and walked on without answering. There was something about the way she stood at the edge of camp during the long, gray hours before sunrise, watching the tree line with a patience that unsettled men who had spent years learning to read exactly that kind of stillness in each other. She never carried a weapon during those morning rounds, only the coffee pot and a small folded cloth tucked into her jacket, and yet nobody who watched her closely ever mistook her for someone without purpose. Logan mentioned it once to Mason, quietly, almost embarrassed to admit that a woman who served coffee made him feel the way he had felt standing beside veteran instructors during his earliest training. Mason had only nodded, filing the observation away the way a good officer files away anything that does not yet make sense but might matter later. The younger soldiers began to whisper among themselves in the evenings, huddled around portable heaters, breath visible in the lamplight. Why would someone so composed, so quietly disciplined, spend her days serving coffee instead of standing post with a rifle? Why did her hands never tremble in weather that made grown men curse and shake? Why did she watch the mountains the way a hunter watches a tree line, patient, unblinking, waiting for something none of them could name? The questions built slowly, the way suspicion always does in isolated places, until the entire camp seemed to be holding its breath around a woman who never gave anyone a reason to ask twice. Some of the younger rangers tried, in their own clumsy way, to draw her out, asking about her hometown, her family, The life she must have led before arriving in a place this remote and this brutal. She answered these questions the way she answered everything, with brief, pleasant fragments that revealed almost nothing, redirecting the conversation back toward them with an ease that felt less like evasion and more like genuine curiosity about the people around her. One soldier joked that she probably had a farm somewhere, a quiet house, a life so ordinary it explained the peace she carried. Another disagreed, insisting there was something underneath her calm that did not match the story of an ordinary life at all, though he could never quite explain what made him so certain. Years before that frozen camp in the Brooks Range, Evelyn Hayes had been something else entirely. She had entered sniper training as an unremarkable recruit, quiet then too, easy to overlook among louder personalities chasing glory. But somewhere in those brutal months of instruction, something in her changed, or perhaps something that had always been there simply found its outlet. She finished every course at the top of her class. She broke record after record for distance, for accuracy, for the patience required to hold a position for days without moving, without eating, without giving away a single sign of her presence to an enemy searching the same terrain. Instructors, who had trained hundreds of recruits over the years, began to speak of her differently than they spoke of anyone else who passed through their program, describing an instinct for terrain and timing that could not be taught, only recognized. She could read wind by the way distant grass bent, could judge distance almost to the meter by nothing more than the shape of a target against a horizon most people would have found featureless. Her fellow trainees, at first dismissive of the quiet woman who rarely spoke during meals, slowly came to understand that she was operating on a level none of them could easily reach, and the mockery that had followed her in the earliest weeks faded into something closer to quiet respect, then eventually into something like awe. By the time she reached her final deployment in that earlier chapter of her career, Evelyn Hayes held a reputation whispered about in command briefings but never spoken aloud in public record. She held the longest confirmed distance in her division's history. She had saved hundreds of soldiers across a series of operations that remain, to this day, sealed behind classification levels most officers never see. She had been awarded a medal so secret that even the citation describing her actions had been locked away, its details known only to a handful of commanders who had since retired or passed away, carrying the story with them into silence. But glory in that world rarely came without cost, and for Evelyn, the cost arrived during a mission that no official report ever fully explained. Something went wrong in those final hours, a calculation that should have worked, a shot that should have saved everyone, a chain of decisions made under pressure that no training could have fully prepared her for. Soldiers under her protection did not make it home. The details remained buried deliberately, protected by classification and by her own refusal to speak of them, but the outcome was clear enough to anyone who later searched for her name. She requested reassignment. She stepped away from the front line entirely. She asked, in writing, that her records be sealed and her name removed from active rosters that might one day bring her back into that world. Nobody in her old unit understood why the finest marksman they had ever trained walked away at the height of her abilities. Her superiors tried to talk her out of it, offered promotions, offered new postings, offered every incentive a grateful command structure could imagine. She refused all of it quietly, without drama, and disappeared into administrative postings so far removed from combat that most assumed she had simply left the service altogether. Her name vanished from citations, from training manuals, from the informal legends that snipers tell each other in barracks late at night. By the time she arrived at the Brooks Range outpost years later, carrying coffee instead of a rifle, almost nobody remembered the name Evelyn Hayes at all. In the years between her departure from the front line and her arrival at that frozen outpost, she moved quietly through a series of postings nobody would ever consider prestigious. Filing paperwork, managing supply lines, teaching basic map reading to recruits who had no idea their instructor could once have shot the pencil out of their hand from half a mile away. She never applied for anything that might have returned her to a rifle. She never once mentioned her old life to any of the new faces she encountered along the way. Some nights, alone in whatever quarters she had been assigned, she allowed herself to remember the faces of the soldiers she had lost, turning the memory over slowly, deliberately, the way someone tends an old wound they have decided never fully to let heal, because forgetting felt like its own kind of betrayal. Captain Mason Brooks received his orders on a morning that offered no warning of what was coming. A classified intelligence team had gone dark somewhere deep in the mountains, their last transmission cut off mid-sentence, their location known only within a rough radius that made rescue both urgent and dangerous. Command wanted a rapid extraction. 100 Rangers were assembled within hours, equipment checked twice, weapons inspected, cold weather gear layered against a storm system that meteorologists warned was only going to worsen. Mason briefed his men in a tent lit by a single lantern, his voice steady despite the tension visible in every face around him. The plan seemed sound on paper. Drones would scout ahead. Satellite positioning would guide their route through the passes. Radio contact would keep every unit synchronized as they pushed deeper into hostile terrain. But the enemy, it turned out, had anticipated their arrival with a precision that suggested inside knowledge, a leak somewhere in the chain, or simply a level of preparation that outmatched everything the Rangers had planned for. The moment the column crossed into the deeper valleys, the storm intensified beyond anything the forecasts had predicted, and one by one, every advantage the Rangers believed they carried began to fail. The march itself, in those first hours, felt almost routine despite the weight of what lay ahead. Boots crunching in practiced rhythm through packed snow, breath rising in steady clouds above the column as it wound its way deeper into terrain few of them had ever crossed before. Mason walked near the front, checking his map against landmarks that grew harder to identify as the storm thickened around them, exchanging brief words with Logan Pierce, who moved a short distance behind him, scanning the ridgelines with a trained eye that found nothing but white in every direction. Nobody spoke of fear, though every soldier in that column understood, in the quiet way soldiers always understand these things, that the mountains ahead were hiding something the maps could not show them. Drones lost signal within the first hour, their feeds dissolving into static against interference nobody could immediately explain. GPS coordinates began drifting, subtly at first, then dramatically, throwing navigation into confusion at the worst possible moment. Radio channels filled with noise, garbled fragments of voices cutting in and out until coordination between units became nearly impossible. Snow fell in walls thick enough to reduce visibility to a few meters in any direction, swallowing landmarks, swallowing sound, swallowing the confidence that had carried the column this far into the mountains. Mason Brooks pressed forward anyway, because turning back now, blind and disoriented, seemed just as dangerous as continuing. The ambush revealed itself, not with a single shot but with a coordinated silence that Mason would later describe as the worst sound he had ever experienced, the absence of anything at all just before the world exploded into gunfire. The enemy had claimed every commanding position available in that stretch of terrain, holding the high ground above the pass, controlling a narrow ravine that funneled the Rangers into a killing zone, and occupying an ice slope that offered clear sightlines down onto the exposed column below. Snipers began picking off Rangers with a precision that suggested extensive preparation, each shot landing before anyone could identify where it had come from. Panic spread through the ranks in whispered warnings and shouted orders that fought against the wind for any chance of being heard. Soldiers scrambled for whatever cover the terrain offered, pressing themselves against boulders and snowbanks that provided only partial protection against an enemy who seemed to see everything while remaining completely invisible. One young ranger, pinned behind a shattered outcrop, turned to the soldier beside him with something close to despair in his voice, saying only, "We're finished." The words swallowed almost immediately by another burst of gunfire tearing through the position they had just abandoned. The wounded called out from positions scattered across the slope, their voices thin against the storm, and every attempt to reach them drew fresh gunfire from somewhere unseen above. Medics crawled between positions low against the snow, dragging what supplies they could carry, working with hands numbed by cold to stop bleeding that the frozen air alone seemed to slow, as if even the mountain wanted a share in deciding who would live through the next hour. Logan Pierce, positioned near the center of the formation, tried repeatedly to identify a muzzle flash, a shadow, anything that might reveal where the enemy fire originated, but the storm and the skill of the snipers above denied him even a single clear target. Captain Mason Brooks refused to accept that verdict, moving low along the line, checking on his men, offering the kind of steady presence that kept discipline from collapsing entirely into chaos. "Hold the line," he told them, his voice cutting through the wind with an authority that came from somewhere deeper than simple rank. But authority alone could not manufacture ammunition that did not exist, and as the hours dragged on beneath that merciless barrage, magazines emptied faster than anyone had planned for. faster than any resupply could possibly reach them through a storm that had cut off every avenue of support. At the base camp, miles away and separated from the ambush by mountains that seemed determined to keep help from arriving, Colonel Ethan Ward received the fragmented reports with a growing sense of helplessness that few in his position ever allowed themselves to feel. He listened as staff officers confirmed, one after another, that every conventional option had failed. Helicopters could not fly in conditions this severe. Artillery batteries had no clear line of sight through terrain this treacherous. Remaining drones had lost signal entirely, their last known positions offering nothing but static and silence. The colonel stood over a map table covered in markers representing men who were, at that very moment, running out of time. An officer beside him finally voiced the thought that had been circling the command tent for several tense minutes, asking quietly whether there was truly nothing left to try, whether the situation had genuinely reached the point where 100 trapped Rangers would simply have to endure until either the storm broke or the ambush ended one way or another. Colonel Ward did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved toward a name buried in a personnel file he had reviewed exactly once since taking command of this outpost, a file marked with classifications that had made him raise an eyebrow the first time he encountered it months earlier. He remembered, in that moment, the strange sensation of reading a file so heavily redacted that entire paragraphs existed only as black bars stretched across the page, a document that told him almost nothing except that whoever it described had once been cleared for operations at a level far beyond anything routinely assigned to this quiet outpost. He remembered wondering, briefly, why a soldier with a file like that would ever request reassignment to a place like this, so far from anything resembling recognition or advancement. He had filed the question away as unimportant at the time, one curiosity among dozens that came with commanding a remote post, never imagining it would matter as much as it suddenly did now, with 100 men trapped and dying in the mountains beyond his reach. Can she still do it? Another officer asked, having noticed where the colonel's attention had drifted, uncertainty and desperate hope mixing in equal measure in his voice. Ward considered the question with the weight it deserved before answering with a certainty that surprised even himself. "She's the only one," he said, and within minutes, a request had been sent to the quiet woman who spent her mornings pouring coffee for men who had no idea what she once was capable of. Evelyn Hayes received the news standing near the mess tent, snow collecting on her shoulders as an exhausted runner delivered the colonel's message directly, breathless from the cold and from the urgency of what he carried. She listened without visible reaction, her expression unreadable in the gray morning light, and then she turned and walked toward her quarters without a single word of hesitation. Inside, beneath a cot that had served her for months without complaint, sat a case she had not opened since arriving at this outpost, its surface layered with dust that had settled undisturbed through every quiet morning she had spent serving coffee instead of carrying a rifle. Her fingers moved across the latches with a familiarity that years of silence had not erased, and when the case finally opened, the weapon inside gleamed faintly despite the dim light, oiled and maintained in secret even during months when she told herself she would never need it again. She lifted it carefully, feeling its weight settle into hands that remembered everything her mind had tried so hard to forget. Somewhere nearby, a young ranger who had wandered past caught a glimpse through the open tent flap and stood frozen in place, coffee mug still in hand, unable to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the transformation unfolding in front of him. Evelyn Hayes did not wait for an escort or for permission beyond what the colonel had already granted. She gathered her gear alone, checked her equipment with movements that betrayed no hesitation, and began the climb toward the ridgeline that separated the base camp from the ambush unfolding somewhere beyond it. The wind had intensified since morning, gusting well past 100 kilometers per hour, driving snow horizontally with enough force to strip warmth from any exposed skin within moments. She pressed forward regardless, her pace measured, her breathing controlled, every step calculated to conserve energy for what still lay ahead. The terrain fought her at every turn, snow deep enough in places to reach her chest, forcing her to half climb, half wade through drifts that seemed determined to swallow her whole. Temperatures continued falling as she gained elevation, the thin mountain air growing sharper with every meter, until each breath felt like inhaling shards of ice directly into her lungs. She found herself alone in a landscape that offered no mercy and no witnesses, just white in every direction, and the distant, muffled echo of gunfire carried on the wind from somewhere beyond the next ridge. More than once, the wind nearly took her off her feet entirely, gusts strong enough to stagger even someone as disciplined and low to the ground as she kept herself, forcing her to plant her rifle case into the snow and wait, motionless, until the worst of each surge passed. Her muscles burned with an ache that years away from this kind of exertion had made unfamiliar again. And yet some older part of her, some version of herself she had buried but never fully lost, recognized the pain as an old companion rather than a stranger. She thought, briefly, of the men trapped somewhere below her, of Captain Mason Brooks holding a line that could not hold much longer, and the thought alone was enough to push her legs forward through snow that seemed determined to stop her. When she finally reached a position she judged suitable, she began the painstaking work of building her firing point entirely by hand, digging into packed snow and frozen earth with tools she had carried strapped to her pack for exactly this purpose. She shaped the position to break her outline against the surrounding terrain, layering snow and debris until her silhouette disappeared into the landscape around her. Every motion was deliberate, unhurried despite the urgency driving her forward, because a shot attempted before the position was properly prepared would accomplish nothing but revealing herself to an enemy who still had no idea what was climbing toward them through the storm. With her position established, Evelyn began the mental calculations that no piece of equipment on her body could replace, working through variables that separated an impossible shot from a fatal miscalculation. She accounted for the wind sweeping across the ridgeline in shifting gusts that required constant reassessment. She factored in the thinning air pressure at this altitude, understanding how it would affect the bullet's flight differently than lower elevations she had trained in years before. She considered the slow, invisible rotation of the Earth itself, a factor that mattered only at distances few marksmen ever attempted, and she weighed the punishing cold against every known adjustment required to compensate for it. All of it unfolded in her mind without a single calculator, without any digital assistance, relying entirely on instinct sharpened by years of training that had never truly left her, no matter how long she had tried to walk away from it. She lay motionless in the position she had carved, her body pressed flat against the snow, patient in a way that had nothing to do with waiting and everything to do with becoming part of the landscape itself. Minutes passed, then more minutes, the storm shifting around her in patterns. She read the way another person might read a familiar book, each gust telling her something new about the conditions between her position and the target far below. Her mind moved slowly and carefully through every factor, discarding nothing, rushing nothing, because a single miscalculation at this distance would mean nothing but a wasted shot and 100 men left to die without the miracle they so desperately needed. The distance to her target measured 4,109 meters, a figure that would have seemed like fiction to anyone unfamiliar with what she had once been capable of achieving. No confirmed shot in recorded history had ever traveled that far and found its mark with the kind of precision this moment demanded. Her target was clear through brief gaps in the swirling snow, an enemy commander directing the final assault meant to overwhelm what remained of the trapped rangers below, a man who had no idea that his own death was already being calculated from a ridge more than 4 kilometers away. Evelyn settled into position without a trace of the hesitation any reasonable person might have expected given the impossibility of what she was attempting. Her hands did not shake despite the cold that had numbed most exposed skin on her body. Her breathing slowed into a rhythm she had perfected years earlier, each inhale and exhale timed to align with the exact moment her finger would finally press against the trigger. She said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Only the mountain, the storm, and a decision that had already been made the moment she opened that dusty case beneath her cot. She drew one final breath, held it at the precise point where her body reached perfect stillness, and squeezed the trigger with a control that transformed years of buried skill into a single, irreversible action. The bullet left the barrel and began a flight that would last nearly 8 seconds, an eternity compressed into a span of time most people never consciously experience, carrying with it every calculation she had made, every year of training she had tried to leave behind, and the fate of 100 trapped rangers who had no idea their survival now depended entirely on physics, wind, and the steady hands of a woman they had only ever known as the one who poured their coffee. Those 8 seconds seemed to stretch beyond any reasonable measure of time, the bullet arcing through a storm that fought against it at every meter, wind trying to push it off course, cold trying to slow it, distance trying to defeat it entirely. Evelyn remained perfectly still through all of it, her eye never leaving the scope, her breathing shallow and controlled, watching the space where her target stood without allowing herself even a flicker of doubt about what she had already set into motion. Somewhere far below, unaware that death was already traveling toward him through the storm, the enemy commander continued issuing orders to soldiers who had no idea their advantage was about to disappear entirely. Down in the ambush, chaos continued to unfold as Rangers pressed themselves against whatever cover remained, ammunition dwindling with every passing minute. Captain Mason Brooks moved among his men, offering what encouragement he could manage, refusing to let despair take hold even as the situation grew more desperate by the moment. The enemy commander stood exposed on the high ground, confident in a position that had given his forces every advantage throughout the encounter, directing his snipers toward the final positions, where Rangers still held their ground against overwhelming odds. Nobody below saw the bullet coming, because nobody could have imagined a shot arriving from a distance that defied everything military doctrine considered possible. The projectile cut through the blizzard with a trajectory calculated to survive wind shear, altitude, and distance that should have scattered it far from any intended target. It found the enemy commander at the exact moment his own forces were preparing their final assault, and he collapsed instantly, the shot arriving with no warning sound preceding it, no muzzle flash visible across a distance that vast, just sudden and absolute silence where a moment before there had been command and coordination. The effect on the remaining enemy forces was immediate and total. Without their commander directing the assault, confusion spread rapidly through their ranks. Soldiers uncertain how such a shot could have arrived from seemingly nowhere, uncertain whether more were coming, uncertain whether their carefully constructed ambush had somehow been discovered and turned against them. Formation discipline collapsed within minutes as fear replaced the confidence that had carried them through the earlier hours of the engagement. Captain Mason Brooks recognized the opportunity, the instant he saw the shift in enemy behavior, and his voice cut through the wind with an urgency that left no room for hesitation. "Move," he shouted, and the word carried through the Ranger line like electricity, transforming exhausted, desperate soldiers into a unit suddenly reborn with purpose. They surged forward as one, exploiting the chaos that had spread through enemy positions, pushing through gaps that had not existed moments earlier, fighting with a renewed energy that came from understanding, somehow, that help had arrived from an impossible direction. The encirclement broke within the hour, the Rangers cutting their way through weakened resistance and finally reaching terrain that offered a path back toward friendly lines. Casualties had occurred throughout the engagement, wounds that would take months to heal and losses that would never fully be forgotten, but the total collapse that had seemed inevitable just hours earlier had been averted entirely. 100 Rangers who had faced near certain destruction walked, limp, or were carried out of those mountains because of a single shot fired from a distance nobody would have believed possible until that very afternoon. Captain Mason Brooks moved among his surviving men as they finally reached safer ground, checking wounds, offering quiet words to soldiers still shaking from what they had endured, counting faces against the roster he had carried into those mountains hours earlier with a dread that had not fully left him even now that the worst had passed. He did not yet know where the impossible shot had come from, only that it had arrived at the exact moment his men needed it most, and as he looked back toward the ridgeline where it must have originated, he found himself wondering what kind of person could have made a shot like that, and where they had been standing all this time without anyone realizing what they were capable of. In the days that followed the operation, questions began circulating through command channels about the shot that had apparently saved the entire mission, a shot too extraordinary to simply file away without explanation. Investigators pulled records, cross-referenced classified archives, and eventually connected details that led directly back to a name few remembered and fewer still understood. When Evelyn Hayes's sealed file finally reached the appropriate desks, the reaction among officers reviewing it ranged from disbelief to something closer to reverence. The file revealed everything her years of silence had kept hidden from the Rangers she had served alongside without a single one of them suspecting the truth. She had once held the longest confirmed distance record in the entire sniper program before this shot broke it beyond anyone's expectations. She had saved hundreds of soldiers across operations still shrouded in classification, actions that had earned her recognition so secret that even now, only a handful of officers held clearance to read the full details. She had walked away from all of it after a mission that haunted her, choosing anonymity over glory, choosing coffee pots over rifles, choosing silence over the recognition she had more than earned. Word spread through the outpost with the particular speed that only truth this astonishing can travel. moving from officer to soldier, from soldier to friend, until every corner of the camp understood who had truly been living among them all along. Soldiers who had laughed gently at her nicknames, who had wondered idly why such a calm woman spent her days serving coffee instead of standing post, found themselves sitting in stunned silence as the details settled into place. One young ranger, the same one who had frozen outside her tent watching her lift that rifle from its dusty case, spoke the thought that seemed to hang over the entire camp in the aftermath of everything that had happened. "We never knew," he said quietly, and nobody around him offered any correction, because it was true for every single one of them. Logan Pierce, who had once jokingly asked her whether she had ever fired a weapon, found himself replaying that conversation over and over in his mind, embarrassed now by how casually he had posed the question to someone who had once held records he had spent his entire career trying to approach. He sought her out that evening, uncertain exactly what he intended to say, and found her exactly where he expected, near the mess tent, quietly cleaning equipment as though nothing about her life had changed at all. He managed only a handful of words, an apology of sorts for never having seen what was standing in front of him the entire time, and she answered him the way she answered most things, with a small, forgiving smile that asked for no apology at all. A ceremony was arranged within the week, held in the open air of the camp despite the continuing cold, snow falling gently rather than raging as it had during the ambush, as though even the mountain itself had chosen to offer a moment of peace. Rangers gathered in formation, faces marked by the exhaustion of recent days but eyes carrying something that had not been there before. A mixture of gratitude and quiet awe directed toward a woman most of them had barely spoken to beyond routine morning greetings over steaming mugs of coffee. Colonel Ethan Ward stood before the assembled unit and spoke briefly about courage that hides itself without ever asking for recognition, about skill maintained in silence for years without a single opportunity to prove itself until the exact moment it was needed most. He held in his hands a set of insignia that had once belonged to Evelyn Hayes during her earlier service, symbols she had surrendered voluntarily when she stepped away from that life years before, and he returned them to her now in front of the entire camp, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. He spoke, too, of the particular kind of strength it takes to walk away from glory rather than toward it, acknowledging that whatever had happened years earlier to drive her from the front line had clearly never been a matter of failure or fear, but something closer to grief carried so heavily that only distance from that world had allowed her to keep functioning at all. He said he understood, better now than he had before reading her file, why a woman capable of the impossible would choose instead to spend her days quietly pouring coffee for men who never knew what stood beside them. The camp listened in a silence that held more respect than any applause could have offered, snow falling softly around them as the colonel's words settled over the gathered rangers. Captain Mason Brooks stepped forward next, and rather than offer words that might have felt inadequate given everything she had done, he simply bowed his head toward her, a gesture of respect that carried more weight than any speech could have managed. The rangers around him followed his lead, and for a long moment, the entire camp stood in silence, broken only by the soft sound of falling snow, honoring a woman who had spent months quietly serving them without ever once suggesting what she was truly capable of. Nobody called her the coffee girl after that day. The nickname retired not out of embarrassment, but out of a recognition that it no longer captured even a fraction of who she was. The Rangers began referring to her simply as the Legend, a title spoken with genuine respect rather than exaggeration, passed from soldier to soldier until it became as natural as any rank or title she had ever held. Evelyn Hayes accepted the new name the same way she had accepted every nickname before it, with a small, quiet smile that revealed nothing and everything at once. The following morning arrived with the same brutal cold that had defined every morning since the camp's establishment, the wind still carrying traces of the storm that had nearly ended everything just days earlier. And yet, as the sun made its brief appearance over the ridgeline, Evelyn Hayes emerged from her quarters carrying the same battered metal pot she had carried every single day before the ambush, moving slowly through the camp, filling mugs for young rangers who now watched her with entirely different eyes than they had before. She said nothing about what had happened. She offered no explanation, no story, no acknowledgement beyond the same quiet nod she had always given as she poured coffee into waiting hands. For her, it seemed, nothing fundamental had changed, only the way others now understood the woman who had been standing among them all along. She continued walking the length of the camp exactly as she always had, steam rising from the pot in her hands, disappearing into the cold morning air, as though the mountain itself had simply absorbed the story back into its silence, the way it absorbed everything eventually. Captain Mason Brooks watched her from a distance that morning, standing near his tent with a mug he had not yet touched, and found himself thinking that perhaps this was the truest measure of everything she had once been trained to become, not the distance of the shot or the precision of the calculation, but this, the willingness to return to something small and ordinary the very next day without needing the world to keep celebrating what she had done. He raised his mug slightly in her direction when she passed, a small gesture that asked for nothing and expected nothing, and she answered it with the same quiet smile she had always carried, the one that had fooled an entire camp for months and would likely fool the next one just as easily, wherever the mountains eventually sent her. The camera, if there had been one, might have pulled back slowly from that scene, capturing the full expanse of the Brooks Range buried beneath endless white, the small outpost nestled against those unforgiving peaks looking impossibly fragile against the scale of the mountains surrounding it. Smoke curled gently from a few scattered fires, figures moved slowly between tents, small against the vast landscape, indistinguishable from any other morning in that remote corner of the world, and somewhere among them, a woman who had once again become simply the one who poured the coffee walked her familiar path, carrying within her a truth the camp would never forget, even as she herself seemed determined to let it fade quietly back into the snow. Heroes rarely ask to be remembered, they simply make sure everyone else comes home.